The story is called The Thing Itself. Something was about to happen. He could feel it. He could feel it with the same eerie certainty he used to have in his school days, when he would know a millisecond before it happened whether his ball was going to connect with the ball, whether his bat was going to connect with the ball. He could feel it the way he would occasionally dream of an old school friend the day before he received a letter from him, the way he once suddenly understood watching his mother's car halting for him at the curb of his school at 3 o'clock, that his dog had run away again, this time for good. The way, pursuing his solitary interests years later, he knew without prior warning from his library that Harris's The Art of Astonishment had arrived, and he could stop in on his walk home and claim its varicolored pages at the reference desk. The way he'd always known a rainy evening in a cloudless day. Its precise dimensions eluded him. There was simply an amorphous excitement, a peripheral tingling that had begun to pervade his waking hours, making it difficult for him to sleep. And when he did sleep, even his dreams were harbingers. They'd become vivid and strange. Never memorable, at least not in describable terms. They left a residual scent on his skin. His body, when he awoke, had the faintly metallic sweetness that used to clothe him after hours spent in the sun as a child. How strange that he should awaken smelling as if he'd been playing all day in the woods outside Durham, New Hampshire, a place he hadn't visited in 30 years. Such premonitions used to frighten him. Once he seemed to know in advance that he was going to be mugged. He'd just taken the job with the new firm, and for an entire week he felt overly aware of strangers in his personal space. One day he decided to photocopy the contents of his wallet, although he couldn't have said why. At first he thought of asking Daphne, the paralegal who wore low-cut blouses and black fingernail polish, to do it for him. But he'd concluded it was more prudent to do it himself. That night, on the way from his favorite restaurant to his car, he was cornered by a hooded man with a knife in the parking lot. Even as he surrendered the calfskin billfold, he couldn't help thinking with a dark pride, I knew it. But he was a man of logic, not superstition. He was a lawyer. True, he was a lawyer in Los Angeles, but still there were certain standards. He didn't think he possessed ESP. On the contrary, he wondered if these weren't instances of SSP, subtle sensory perception. Possibly the mugger had been casing him throughout the week before going in for the attack, and he'd noticed him subconsciously. Perhaps the old school friend had called and left no message, but he'd seen the name flash by his caller ID. Maybe he'd glimpsed a smudge of tears on his mother's face, or had seen a dog collar, or some other token in her hand. There were always explanations for things, if he looked hard enough. Or so he told himself. Unheeding, his heart beat back its answer. Something was coming, and soon. You mean like the way you know when you're about to sneeze? Daphne asked, crossing her legs on her side of the booth at Bandera. She was wearing black leather boots that laced up to her knees. She'd been an aspiring actress and still had the clothes. Sort of like that, he said, I guess. It was possible telling her had been a mistake. On an impulse, he'd chosen her as the person in whom to confide. She seemed more open to paranormal exotica than his friends. He needed to tell someone, and he couldn't tell his wife. His wife's parents had died in a plane crash when she was 10. When she and he were first dating in the mid-90s, she'd become pregnant and had had an abortion. Then, when they were married several years later, she hadn't been able to conceive. Now they were both well into their 40s, and she, more than he, was haunted by the one child they seemingly could have had, the gift they'd thrown away. She had little tolerance for talk of premonitions. He lifted his glass, then put it down. Actually, it feels sort of like déjà vu, he said, except in reverse. I'm not sure I know what that means, said Daphne, and he realized she had a point. She sat staring into her globe of Merlot, her handsome face catching its scarlet refractions. Was she disappointed she'd never made it as an actress? She was probably in her late 30s, though he'd always had difficulty telling ages, but her heart-shaped face and little girl voice made her seem much younger. If having to give up her dreams had broken her spirit, she didn't show it. Unless, do you mean like feeling nostalgic for a place you've never been? Yes, he said, more like that. She reached for her purse, a red suede thing with fringes. Would you like me to read your cards? I have a tarot deck in here somewhere. No, no thanks. He was feeling burdened enough by his presentiments. He didn't need do-it-yourself prophecy added to the mix. Daphne stopped rummaging. I'm not sure how I can help you then, Felix. I don't need help exactly. I just thought I should tell someone. He knew how they must look to passers-by. A slightly overweight, nervous-seeming lawyer sitting across from a lithe, semi-goth paralegal at a steakhouse 3 blocks from their office. A flash of heat crossed his face, and the roots of his hair prickled with sweat. The last time this happened, I was mugged, he said, as if that would explain things. So you think you're about to be mugged, she asked, snapping the thin thread of understanding he'd hoped was being spun between them. In the 2 years she'd been working at his firm, she had occasionally entered his fantasies, but he'd never before had the temerity to ask her to join him for an after-work drink. No, he said, staring at his untouched gimlet. That's not it. It's more... He struggled to think of a way to explain the sense of urgency he felt like a rising tide in his bloodstream. It's more like this bumper sticker I once saw on the back of an 18-wheeler. He found himself thinking of the tailpipe slogan several times a day. It cropped up unbidden in myriad idle moments. That said what? After a rolling ball comes a running child. She looked at him. Her eyes were smudged with black like a raccoon's, and for a second she reminded him of the way his wife used to look when she was younger, after she'd been on one of her crying jags. Sounds like a line from a poem, she said. She pulled a compact from her purse and began to refresh her lipstick. No, he shifted in his seat. His collar felt tight. The air in the room was too close. Don't you see? It's a warning. It's meant to warn other truckers so something awful doesn't happen. Daphne looked confused and a little irritated. Her cell phone chirped, and he wondered if she'd somehow willed it to do so. She read the text message eagerly and slid a $10 bill under the empty wine glass. It's my boyfriend, she said. I have to go. Janet was brushing her teeth. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in his jacket and bow tie. He looked handsome in bow ties, had since he was little. They'd just come from an office party where he'd had several seltzer waters. Lately he felt it necessary to remain clear-headed at all times. And she'd had enough wine that the little chapped patches of skin on her lips had gone purple. I think the new partner likes you, he said. Janet spat into the sink, ran the water. What makes you say that? I can just tell. That's not a bad thing, is it? No. He undid his tie, still sitting. For some reason he lacked the energy to stand up and undress properly. After a moment, Janet flushed the toilet. Then she emerged from the bathroom and sidled up next to him on the bed, smiling. She seemed happier than usual. At the party, an associate had been trying to convince her that she should get an iPod, saying there were so many scholarly podcasts on the web, it was a shame not to have access to them during her long commute. Especially someone like her who worked in research and liked to keep up to date.